Okay, let's dive in. We're looking today, June 4th, 2025, at a really interesting question for St. Johns County, Florida.
Right.
You think St. John's, you probably picture, well, historic St. Augustine, those amazing beaches, right? Tourism is huge there.
Absolutely central. Yeah.
But like a lot of growing places, they're thinking about diversification.
Right.
How do you build sustainable growth? How do you get higher paying jobs into the mix?
And that leads straight to the big question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What kind of manufacturing, if any, really fits? Fits with that unique character, fits with that tourism economy.
It's a balancing act.
Definitely. And we've got a pile of material here, reports, studies, news articles, all sort of wrestling with this.
And our mission today, for you listening, is to really unpack this stuff. We want to pull out the clearest insights. What kinds of manufacturing are even on the table for Northeast Florida?
And crucially, where do these sources say they can fit, and maybe more importantly, where they can't?
Specifically for St. John's. What does it mean for their economy, their identity, and that critical tourism sector? What does the material tell us about finding that right fit?
And the first thing these sources just hammer home is how dominant tourism is right now in St. John's. The scale is, well, it's huge.
It really is. The sources point to an annual economic impact just from tourism, somewhere between $3.2 and $3.8 billion.
Brilliant. That's a staggering number.
Yeah, and it's driven by a massive number of visitors. We're talking, what, 6.5 to 6.6 million people visiting the county every single year.
Wow. Think about the jobs that supports. The numbers here show over 32,000 jobs are directly tied to tourism.
And here's a detail that really matters, especially for the county's budget. All those visitors, they pay the tourist development tax, the TDT. That brings in around $24 million a year.
Okay, so $24 million. Why should you, listening at home, care about that specific number?
Because that tax money, it's not just abstract revenue. It directly pays for essential stuff, things like beach maintenance, keeping the parks looking good.
Beach renourishment, too, right? Which is critical there.
Critical. And funding for cultural programs, concerts, those festivals, historic reenactments. Things residents enjoy, but also things that enhance the visitor experience.
So the material makes it clear tourism isn't just, an industry. It's foundational. It underpins the county's finances and quality of life.
Exactly. Foundational is the right word.
Which makes sense then, looking at the county's own strategic master plan. It's mentioned here. Preserving tourism is priority number one.
Paramount, yeah.
But interestingly, it also clearly states a goal for diversification, for sustainable growth, and importantly, higher wages. It's about adding to the mix, not replacing.
Right. It's not an either. And the sources also point out St. John's isn't exactly starting from zero with other types of businesses.
Okay.
Well, there's already some light industrial activity, things like aircraft component manufacturing, some specialty food producers, biomedical research products, even some high-tech wire manufacturing.
So there's a base there already, a starting point for this kind of diversification they're aiming for.
Precisely. It's not a blank slate.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second. What's the bigger picture for manufacturing across Florida? Is this conversation unique to St. John's?
Not entirely.
Mm.
Stepping back, you see manufacturing growing significantly statewide. And that broader trend is definitely influencing the local conversation in places like St. John's.
How much growth are we talking?
Well, one report notes that 2022 saw the most new manufacturing businesses open in Florida since way back in 2002. It's a pretty strong signal.
Yeah, it is. And there's this multiplier effect too, right?
A big one. The data suggests that for every 100 direct jobs in, say, durable goods manufacturing, you get over 744 indirect jobs supported elsewhere in the economy.
Wow. Like logistics, suppliers.
Services, all sorts of things. It ripples outwards.
And the overall economic contribution, how does manufacturing stack up statewide?
It's impressive. Manufacturing GDP in Florida went from about $43.5 billion in 2014 up to $73 billion in 2022.
That's doing the math. Almost 68% growth.
Nearly 68%, yeah. And these sources point out that its contribution to the state's GDP has actually surpassed tourism, agriculture, and transportation statewide.
That's surprising. Tourism feels so dominant.
It is, in certain regions like St. John's. But statewide, manufacturing's economic footprint is huge. And critically, it means jobs. Over 422,000 Floridians work in the sector.
And better paying jobs generally.
Significantly. The average annual wage in manufacturing is noted as being over $97,000. Compare that to the average for all non-farm jobs, which is around $71,000. That's a big difference for families.
Okay, now here's something in the material that honestly kind of surprised me. It challenges that image of, giant factories.
Ah, you mean the size of these businesses?
Exactly. Florida's manufacturing sector is overwhelmingly driven by small businesses.
It's a really crucial point the sources highlight. Get this, 66%, two-thirds of manufacturing businesses in Florida have fewer than 10 employees.
Fewer than 10.
And almost all of them, 94.4%, have fewer than 100 employees.
Ah.
So, yeah, it's not primarily about smokestacks and massive plants. It's often smaller, more specialized outfits.
So what does that imply for economic development strategy, particularly in a place like St. John's that's trying to be selective?
It completely reframes the approach, doesn't it? It means success isn't just about landing one huge company. It's maybe more about nurturing and supporting these smaller guys.
Helping them grow.
Exactly. And the sources identify the hurdles these smaller firms face. Things like getting access to capital, dealing with rising business costs, figuring out how to get government contracts. Addressing those issues seems key to fostering the kind of manufacturing growth Florida's already seeing.
Okay, so that brings us right back to St. John's. Given that statewide picture and St. John's intense focus on protecting tourism, what kind of manufacturing do these sources say could actually work there? What are the characteristics of this right fit?
The material gets pretty specific here. They talk about needing clean operations. That means, minimal noise, minimal odors, not being an eyesore.
Right. Blends in.
Scale is also key. Needs to be appropriate, not some massive facility that dominates the landscape. And ideally, maybe some synergy with tourism.
How so?
Well, could they offer tours, demonstrations, maybe have a retail component appealing to visitors? That's seen as a plus. Environmental responsibility is huge, obviously. Sustainable practices.
And minimal impact on roads and infrastructure, I assume? Traffic is already a headache there.
Absolutely. Low impact on infrastructure and traffic is critical. They can't handle much more strain in certain areas.
Okay, so let's get concrete. What kinds of industries or sectors do the sources point to as being potentially compatible?
Several come up repeatedly. Especially food production seems like a natural fit. Think artisanal chocolates, craft breweries or distilleries, maybe local honey producers.
Yeah, I can see that. You could definitely build visitor experiences around that. Maybe tie into local agriculture from Hastings, a made in St. Augustine kind of brand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's artisanal crafts and goods, handcrafted furniture, pottery, jewelry. Fits the historic artsy vibe.
Clean, low impact, potential for workshop tours, selling direct to tourists. Makes sense.
Biomedical research products are mentioned too. Things like medical devices, diagnostic kits.
High value jobs there, presumably.
Typically, yes. High skill, high wage jobs. And these are often very clean operations, sometimes in campus-like settings or even office parks. Low visibility.
What about tech? Electronics.
Yeah, technology and electronics. Manufacturing things like precision electronics, maybe Internet of Things devices. Again, usually clean, quiet, needs skilled people, doesn't take up a huge footprint. Low demand on heavy infrastructure.
And being coastal, marine-related manufacturing comes up too, like boat building.
Custom boat building, marine accessories, things like that. It connects directly to the county's heritage and supports the recreational boating and fishing scene, which is part of the tourism draw anyway.
So it's not just the type of business, it's also about where it goes in the county, right? Location, location, location.
Crucial. The sources stress this. Compatible doesn't mean anywhere. It needs the right zoning. It needs careful buffering from tourist hotspots and residential areas.
Aesthetics matter.
Absolutely. How does it look? How does it integrate? Plus, rigorous environmental management and really thinking through the transportation impacts. It has to be thoughtfully placed.
Okay, so that paints a picture of what could fit. But the flip side is just as important. These sources seem very clear about what fundamentally doesn't work in St. Johns County. Why is large-scale, heavy industry seen as so incompatible?
Yeah, this is really the core tension the material explores. And there are multiple pretty solid reasons laid out. First off, you've got the regulatory environment itself.
The county rules.
Right. St. Johns County's comprehensive plan, its zoning laws, they are explicitly set up to prioritize homes, shops, hotels, tourism. There's very, very little land zone for heavy industrial use. And the stated goals in those plans, protecting tourism, preserving history, environmental protection, they inherently clash with heavy industry.
And the environmental risks must be a huge factor in a sensitive coastal area like St. John's.
Absolutely critical. You've got wetlands, sensitive coastal habitats, wildlife corridors, important areas for recharging the aquifer, all highly vulnerable to the kind of pollution heavy industry can generate.
Concerns about water quality.
Big concerns, potential impacts on the rivers, the intracoastal, maybe groundwater contamination.
Okay.
And you have to layer on top of that The county's vulnerability to climate change, sea level rise, bigger storms, heavy industry can make adapting to that even harder.
Infrastructure comes up again, too, as a major limiting factor.
Yes, definitely. Sources are clear. The road network just isn't designed for constant heavy truck traffic. Think about historic St. Augustine, those narrow streets. Totally incompatible.
Plus, congestion is already bad in places.
It's already identified as a major issue. And the utility systems, water, sewer, power, natural gas, they aren't scaled for the huge demands of heavy industry without massive, expensive upgrades.
And then there's the direct hit to the county's identity, its brand, tourism, and history.
This might be the biggest conflict of all, large industrial plants. Well, they aren't exactly scenic, are they? They clash visually with the natural beauty and historic landscapes that people come to see.
You worry about the historic district, too.
Definitely. Vibration, air quality issues from nearby heavy industry could literally damage those centuries-old buildings in St. Augustine. And that authentic experience tourists pay for. It gets eroded. Noise, bad air, more traffic jams. It degrades the very visitor experience that drives billions in economic activity.
The sources also mention an economic mismatch. What does that mean?
It means a couple of things. First, the workforce. The skills base in St. John's is largely in services, tourism, healthcare, professional jobs, not necessarily the specific skills needed for heavy industry.
And attracting those workers could be tough.
Very tough, mainly because of housing costs. The material cites a median home price over $550,000. That's a huge barrier for typical industrial wage earners. So workers would likely commute in from elsewhere, meaning less local economic benefit.
And land is expensive, too.
Exactly. High land values, driven by demand for homes and tourism development, make heavy industrial uses less attractive financially compared to other options.
Okay, so the picture emerging is heavy industry, bad fit for St. John's. But the material is also clear that it does have a place nearby in the region.
That's the other side of the coin. The sources strongly suggest that while these large industrial operations don't work for St. John's, they are actually a very good fit for neighboring Duval County and Jacksonville.
Why there specifically? What advantages does Duval have, according to these sources?
Well, first, they have the zoning for it. Extensive areas zoned specifically for heavy industrial uses, manufacturing, big distribution centers, port terminals, you name it.
Infrastructure, too, I assume.
Far superior for this kind of thing. We're talking direct access to major interstates, I-95, I-10, major rail lines and yards for CSX, Norfolk Southern, a deep water seaport, JX port, that handles huge cargo volumes, air cargo facilities. Plus, established industrial parks ready to go, like out on the west side or Cecil Commerce Center. Jacksonville has intentionally built that heavy industrial capacity.
And their economic development strategy aligns with that.
Completely. The sources say Jacksonville actively recruits these kinds of businesses. They offer incentives, tax breaks like no state sales tax on manufacturing equipment, and they have workforce programs geared towards industrial skills.
Is there a recent example that illustrates this?
Yeah, a great one highlighted in the material is Holland. They're a German company making autonomous vehicles. They're building a massive facility in Jacksonville, a $100 million investment, 500,000 square feet.
Wow, big project.
Big project, expecting to create about 150 jobs initially. That's exactly the kind of large-scale manufacturing that fits Jacksonville's profile, according to these analyses.
So bringing it right up to today, June 4th, 2025, there have been some recent developments mentioned in these sources that really seem to highlight this whole dynamic, right? This idea of the right fit regionally.
Yes, exactly. In fact, the Florida Economic Development Council just recently recognized a couple of projects in Northeast Florida that really showcase this.
And the one in St. Johns County sounds like a perfect example of that compatible manufacturing we were just talking about.
It really is. Publix, the supermarket chain, is investing $145 million in a new pharmaceutical facility there. Importantly, it's going into an existing industrial park.
And the jobs? Are they the higher wage type the county wants?
Looks like it. They're talking 150 jobs to start, maybe growing to 400, with average wages around 125% of the county average. The source actually called it a huge win for attracting that high-end advanced manufacturing in health sciences.
And crucially, the material calls this Publix project compatible. Why?
Because it fits those criteria we discussed. It's clean, it's high-tech, minimal environmental footprint. It's seen as a prime example of the right kind of manufacturing for St. John's, adding value without creating those conflicts that heavy industry would.
And you contrast that with the Hold-On project up in Jacksonville.
Right. That's the example of where the big industrial stuff fits best regionally. It shows this kind of regional thinking. Different parts of Northeast Florida are suited for different kinds of economic activity based on what's already there.
There was one other recent news item from around April 2025 that really drove home how critical tourism money is for St. John's, wasn't there?
Ah, yes, the debate about the tourist development councils. There's a proposed state bill that could have eliminated them.
And St. John's officials were not happy.
Not at all. They were quoted saying it would be devastating. It really highlights how much they rely on that $24 million or so in TDT funds. It's not just for marketing. It pays for essentials like beach renourishment, protecting property, and the beaches themselves and other amenities. It shows just how tied the county's basic services are to that tourism engine.
So even if St. John's focuses only on attracting this compatible manufacturing, it's not like it's challenge-free, right? The sources point out some
No,
hurdles.
definitely not easy street. The workforce issue is real. Even for clean manufacturing, you need skilled labor. But can those workers afford to live in St. Johns County?
With that median home price over 550K, probably tough.
Very tough. That's a barrier. The material flags. It could mean workers commute in, which means less local spending, maybe more traffic. It complicates the picture.
Infrastructure is still an issue too, even for lighter industry.
Yes. The sources mention that even with available industrial land, St. John's has a huge backlog of unfunded road and infrastructure needs. That backlog can slow down growth and make it more expensive for businesses to operate there.
And the environmental protection piece never goes away.
Never, especially on the coast. Protecting those ecosystems has to remain a top priority. It requires more than just meeting minimum rules. It means proactive measures, really pushing for eco-friendly practices as new businesses come in.
Okay, so pulling it all together from these sources, what's the recommended path forward for St. Johns County? What should they be doing?
The consensus seems to be focus. Focus intensely on attracting and supporting the right kind of manufacturing, those smaller scale, clean, compatible sectors like specialty food, crafts, biomedical, tech.
Define what compatible means very clearly.
Yes, establish clear criteria,
Yeah.
and then create specific zones where this type of manufacturing can go, making sure they're well buffered from neighborhoods and tourist areas.
And be comfortable directing the big, heavy industrial projects elsewhere.
Absolutely. Guide them towards Duval County, where the infrastructure and zoning make sense. Foster that regional collaboration. And look for ways manufacturing and tourism can actually help each other. Tours, retail, branding.
And keep supporting tourism. Don't neglect the golden goose.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Maintain strong support and funding for tourism promotion and infrastructure. That engine needs to keep running strong.
What about longer-term strategies? Things like workforce development.
Crucial. The material suggests nurturing those niche sectors where St. John's might already have a foothold, like aerospace or biomedical. Investing in targeted job training, STEM education locally that helps residents qualify for those better-paying jobs, like the ones at the new Publix facility.
And tackle the infrastructure backlog.
Proactively address it. It's essential for any kind of growth. Balance that growth with tough environmental standards, maybe promoting green manufacturing, and keep building those public-private partnerships, which seem key to the successes they've had so far.
So stepping back from all this detail, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive into the sources about St. Johns County's Economic Balancing Act?
I think it shows that, yes, the county absolutely can diversify its economy with manufacturing. It's already happening. But the absolute key, the core finding, is that it has to be the right fit.
Small, clean, compatible.
Exactly. Operations that complement the vital tourism sector, rather than conflicting with the county's character, its environment, or overwhelming its infrastructure. It's not about stopping growth, but guiding it smartly.
It really is a balancing act, isn't it? Building a more resilient economy, getting those higher wages, but doing it in a way that preserves what makes St. Johns County, keeping that tourism engine healthy.
That's the goal. Smart, sustainable growth that respects the community's identity.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Thinking about your own community, wherever you live, what does the St. Johns County story tell us about how places make these tough choices about growth and their future? How can communities like yours embrace new economic opportunities, bring in new jobs and industries, but still fiercely protect the identity, the environment, the resources that make them special to begin with? It's a challenge many places are facing, and maybe this deep dive offers some food for thought on navigating it.